Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today, I will talk about an essay written by Tony Judt. He was a historian famously known by his book Cold War. He was an expertise in the Cold War period in Europe. And in this essay that is called A Grand Illusion, quote mark, an essay on Europe, he wonders how this idea of the European Union was created from the beginning following a determined plan, or it was more the result of different decisions being taken, how the global war shaped their development, such as the Cold War, the decolonization process, the different kind of internal and external disputes that the different governments had with others. And in that sense, he does a genealogy of the idea of Europe, how from the Second World War was created the European Union, and how this idea has developed until nowadays. Also, how this kind of difficult beginnings in creating a supranational body which will cover a significant part of the continent will later have consequences, because one of the most difficult things to do was to kind of establish a balance between the national sovereignty and also following the kind of lead by this supranational body. In that sense, Tony Judt points how in 1951, 6 years after the Second World War was ended, Europe created the European Coal and Steel Community, which at that time it was a six-nation community formed by France, Italy, West Germany, and the countries of the Benelux. Years later, in 1958, it was created the European Economic Community, which eventually started to be called the European Union. But how we reached that state? Well, there were many precedents of ideas for an economic unity in Europe. We had in 1834, in 1848, the year of the revolution in the whole continent, in 1925, 1929, and again 1951 with the European Coal and Steel Community. It's interesting because there was a manifesto in 1922, the year of the interwar period in Europe. It was a bit later, 4 years later after the end of the First World War, in which the League of Nations was established to avoid future wars in the continent. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, we see how this proved to be a failure. However, the attempt to establish a common unity in the continent was not very different from the European Union later on. So why this failed? There were many explanations for that. There was economic crisis in 1929, the crisis of refugees after the collapse of the empire, established a paradigm in which different governments aligned themselves with the far-right elements, and henceforth blaming the refugees create an outburst of rage. People were told that these immigrants were going to take their lands and so on. So you see how the most reactionary and fascist elements took place in many important countries in Europe, such as Germany, Italy, or Austria. Later on, it will take in France, Spain, and Portugal, involving a significant part of the continent. So, going to 1942, the years of the war, Winston Churchill says something significant which kind of summarizes the spirit of some of the elites who tried to create this kind of common unity to first of all defeat the Nazis, and also to plan more ahead to establish this kind of cooperation within the future. Churchill said, quote, "I trust that the European family may act unitedly as one," end quote. At the same time, he did not conceal his fears toward Bolshevism. He was smart enough to understand that the Soviet Union had been decisive in the battle of the year before. Well, the battle that also stayed in that year. So let's say when they were fighting in Stalingrad, Churchill knew that the Soviets were fundamental to defeat Nazism, but at the same time he wanted to create an alliance which exclude the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union Party and the members. In that sense, until the end of 1950s, it was uncommon to find politicians or intellectuals looking beyond their borders, as they advocated for local reformism. So even though Churchill had this kind of vision towards the whole continent, overall the different leaders of the countries tend to worry more, to be more concerned about the internal affairs of their countries. In that sense, Britain remained apart due to its political, cultural and economic links with the non-European world. As part of the island, they had not so often been considered as part of the continent, so even in the first year, they did not want to join the European Economic Community created in 1958. In that sense, they had to do a referendum years later to decide if entering or not in the European Union. And precisely during the campaign of Brexit, this was exemplified as an idea that the British people never wanted to be part of Europe, although the result of Brexit says something different because it was won by the Liberals by just less than 2 points. So it was kind of very tight, but still the use of history to create a non-narrative was fundamental during the campaign of Brexit, that has always been in any kind of political movement that has happened in history. But it is not fair to say that British was the only country that was concerned about entering in this European supranational body and giving up their sovereignty, because as Tony Judt says, the most of the countries did not want to kind of give more importance to the policies implemented by European Union rather than the national one. This was also other of the arguments in which the Brexit campaign was based upon, but also Hungary, Poland or Italy, some of different governments of different countries have been Eurosceptics in that way, appealing to the masses, mentioning that Europe is a kind of bunch of bureaucrats, corrupts, which are trying to impose rules in our countries, which being this a significant part of truth, because there are Eurosceptics from different sides, from the left, from the right, and so on. At the same time, it's true that during the campaign of Brexit specifically, there were a kind of statistics that were being told by Nigel Farage and the UKIP party, which was the main leader organizing the campaign to leave the European Union, which were false, such as that the European Union reclaimed a lot of money from the UK and never gave that back, or that the immigrants were destroying the welfare state. All these statistics were being kind of counterfeit by interesting reports, which basically say that everything that Nigel Farage was saying was not truth. However, doesn't matter, because once you say a lie in the media and this idea is spread towards the community, even though 1 week later somebody says, wait, that wasn't true, people have already believed in first instance what these people said, and that this was important in 2016 because it helped the idea of lying openly in the media, helped to the victories of Nigel Farage in the Brexit campaign for leave the European Union, and also Donald Trump to win the elections in the United States. But going back to the history, there was an agreement in 1957 to establish a common market, and was the effect of the economic boom and hence fundamental to regulate the trade. The fact that European peasants had been susceptible to fascism was a factor to have in consideration. This is idea very important that Tony Judt shares in this article. The government had to implement policies to help a declining peasantry. In those years after the Second World War, there was a great exodus, a rural exodus, people leaving the countryside and going to work into the cities. So there were many peasants that were left behind. The governments, knowing that in the 1920s, 1930s, a significant part of the countryside had allied themselves with the far-right parties, far-right elements, being Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, or other countries like Austria or France, the governments did not want that happen again, so they tried to help those peasants implementing the policies. Tony Judt mentioned that even though they were not as significant in numbers as before, they received a considerable amount of helps. Obviously, many people went to the cities, but especially for the oldest one, they did not have the skills, neither the energy to live their whole life in the countryside and go there to a city to find a job. In that sense, this idea is very interesting, implemented by Judt, how the governments were also remembering what had happened just 10 years before. And with the help of the economic boom, many people working in the cities, raising more taxes for the pressure of the government, these ideas of a new welfare state could be implemented. So, what is Europe? How the European Union was formed, or at least the first supranational body, which was the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, and later on the European Economic Community in 1958? Well, for Tony Judt, Europe in that sense was a fortuitous outcome of separate and distinctive electoral concerns, economic interests, and national political cultures. It was made necessary by circumstance and rendered possible by prosperity. Something for Tony Judt unique and unrepeatable. This paragraph I think is fundamental because it is not that the European Union or the pre-European Union, let's say, kind of institution was following a set of rules, a kind of dogmatic guidelines to establish this new community, but rather it was something that happened at a juncture that for Tony Judt cannot be repeated ever again, because there were many things to be considered. There had been two world wars in barely 3 decades. There was also a Europe that was destroyed, but then there was an economic recovery. So you can imagine people who had lived through the two world wars and also the period later, the interwar period between 1918 until 1939. So you had like 40 years of conflict non-stop, or let's say 30 years, 35 years of conflict, and then you have a huge recovery. So obviously you could think on how those people feel at that time, that after many decades fighting, they will surely want a kind of quiet time. And this economic boom, the kind of arrival of communities from the USA help in order to create this idea of enjoying the leisure times. At the same time, the countries of Europe has been destroyed. There was a great mobilization between countryside and the cities, but also there was a mixture between cultures because there were immigrants from other areas coming to, let's say, the cities of Paris, Berlin, West Berlin. You had also in Milan. So you have a mixture of different communities, same as in UK with the end of empires, the Indian community, the Pakistani, people from the Caribbean arriving there. So the whole continent changed dramatically in barely a couple of decades. In that sense, what was the most important aspects for Tony Judt? He points to the impact of war because it stimulates production in occupied countries. So it was a mixture of war that produce welfare. This seems a paradox, but it is what's happening now in Ukraine. Like the United States is investing a lot of money in the war and they are enriching themselves, at least the elites of that country, because you stimulate production in occupied countries, you produce weapons, and at the end, this kind of money will benefit a kind of people, a certain amount of people. So the impact of war was fundamental. There was also, according to Judt, a shared memory of war, occupation and defeat, repressed unpleasant memories, and the idea of starting from zero. There was not nostalgia as it was after the First World War, in which it was felt that a kind of period of more than 3 decades since the Franco-Prussian War, 1871 until 1914, where there was no conflict, more than 40 years. And in that sense, at that time there has been a kind of nostalgia, according to Tony Judt, but now it was not anymore. People were tired about fighting, so they have all these memories around how this conflict has spread across Europe, so it was important later on to create a new society. The third aspect that Judt points is the Cold War, especially after the coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, and the two Germanys were reincorporated into their blocs. That was important. There was Germany occupied by United States, France, and the United Kingdom, whereas the Eastern Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union. And also the economic boom was accompanied by social and economic reform. For all these reasons, Tony Judt points that this was a unique period in Europe, which is difficult to be repeated again. In that sense, she points how the significance of an external enemy was also fundamental in order to kind of establish this European community. The common enemy obviously was the Soviet Union, and in that sense, they had a kind of external influence that inevitably helped the European community to stay together, although it was not as many cases as it has always been said, because France did not want to ally itself with United States, for instance, who consider it as kind of intervening in the affairs of the European community and so on. So there was still in fights between the Western and the Eastern Bloc, but still the idea of the European community grew as a common objective and binding ideology to be invoked in an integrated Europe. In that sense, for Tony Judt, the good fortune was fundamental for that reason. At the same time, there was advantage in the idea of two blocks in Europe. For Tony Judt, there was no need to incorporate the poorest eastern lands, although the foundation myth of modern Europe was to create a greater pan-European prospect. And as this Europe was for all Europeans, from 1951 to 1989, there were political impediments to fulfill this idea until the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which many countries in the Eastern world incorporate themselves to the European community. There was also a sense of wasted opportunities and disillusionment. The dream of moral revolution of reconstruction in post-war France had not only failed, but according to Albert Camus, fallen into disrepute. Albert Camus, remember, the writer, existentialist, philosopher, political theorist who wrote The Plague in 1947, also The Outsider, The Fall, The Myth of Sisyphus, and was one of the main intellectual figures, had fought in the resistance against the Nazis, had supported the Second Spanish Republic against Francoism. He was very involved in the public sphere, won the Literature Prize, and died by car accident in 1960. In that sense, the worst opportunity was remarked by the growing sense of chronic political instability and of institutional corruption. But, and just to finish the essay of Tony Judt, he finished with a quote by Freud, which was written in Civilization and in this content, concerning the condition of human affection, and for Tony Judt summarized very well how the Western Bloc could hold together against the menace of communism. Freud said, quote, "It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love. so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestation of their aggressiveness, end quote. In other words, this is a kind of guideline for nationalism, how fighting against another, establishing a figure, being symbolic or being real about something which is outside your realm, will help you to kind of hold together, establish alliance to avoid the threat from an external body. And this is what happened for Tony Judt and was one of the main reasons why the European Union consolidated itself after many years, something that had failed strepitously in 1920s, like the League of Nations, but from 1950s it seems to work well. But as we know nowadays, with people being concerned, accepted about the European Union, that process was far from being perfect, and still there are some memories from that time. The history is being told nowadays how United Kingdom did not want to get integrated at the beginning, or at least there was a skepticism, how this current has come to nowadays. So again, the European Union, just the last warning for Tony Judt, it was something unique and unrepeatable. And he told some years later how it was not a crisis of European Union per se, but rather that the European Union was never perfect. It was only created in a particular time in history which all the social conditions were fit for establishing this body, like the impact of war, the shared memory of war, the Cold War, and the economic boom, accompanied by social and economic reforms. The time in which the welfare state was created in Europe after 1945, exemplified by the NHS in the United Kingdom, but also improving the life of millions of people in the whole continent.